Hello everyone. Before we get started, make sure to like and subscribe, and leave a comment saying where you're from and when you watched. That way, YouTube will continue to show you stories like this. Now, let's get started. Asterisk, my name is Jack, a single man who just moved to a quiet neighborhood in the suburbs of the city to start a new life. After many years of living in a quiet place. This house is small but neat, with a green garden and a neat wooden fence. I thought it was the ideal place to live alone in peace. The first afternoon, when I was carrying the bag into the house, I saw my neighbor from the house opposite standing in front of the door. He was an elderly man with silver hair and was small in the afternoon shadow. When I looked over, he started to slowly wave his hand as a greeting. I also smiled back and waved my hand, thinking it was just the normal courtesy between two neighbors who had just met. But something made my back cold when I looked into his emotionless eyes. I went into the house and continued to arrange things until the sun had completely set. When I opened the curtains, I saw the man still standing in the same position. He was still waving his hand and walking slowly towards my house. I felt a little uneasy, but reminded myself that he was probably just joking or greeting a new neighbor. I turned off the lights and decided not to look out the window anymore. That night, I couldn't sleep. The noises outside were like the sound of paper on cement. I opened the curtains and looked out, but saw nothing. There was only my shadow and a light breeze. I went back to bed and tried to sleep again. The next morning, I walked around the neighborhood to get to know people. When I mentioned the man in the house opposite, an elderly woman looked at me with a bewildered expression. She said that the man I saw was called Mr. Howard, but he had died a month before of a heart attack. I stood there in disbelief. I went back home and looked across the street to see that Mr. Howard's house was completely deserted and there was no sign of life. I explained to myself that maybe someone had gone to the bathroom or that I was seeing things wrong. But when I went to sleep, I saw him standing in the house opposite my house, rubbing his hand. This time his face was darker. There was nothing else but a dark shadow, like a lifeless person. I tried to look at her, but the coldness in the room when he appeared made it impossible for me to sleep. Every night he would appear, standing there, just standing there, letting me see him, then waving his hand. One time I turned off the light to calm my nerves, but when he opened it, he was gone. I decided to call the police, but they couldn't find anything unusual. Mr. Howard's house was deserted and no one was there. But things didn't stop there. I started hearing knocks in the middle of the night. When I opened the door, I felt a cold wind coming in. But the morning was cold, and the rain was so cold that the windows were slightly open, making everything blurry. In the sound of the rain, I heard someone calling my name, Jack, Jack. The knocking came from the window. I took out all the glue sticks and saw him standing on the floor, waving his hand towards me while the rain soaked him. His face was emotionless, just a dark mass. I began to lose sleep for many nights in a row. Every time I looked out, I saw that figure standing silently. During the day, I tried to forget about work, but at night, the nightmares repeated. I saw him move closer and closer each day. One night, he stood under my window. He was still holding his hand, but his hands had fallen off and turned into blood. I woke up in a panic and realized that I had slept on the chair in front of my window with the curtains deserted the next morning. I went to the police again and they said no one was home. I was advised to rest and not to imagine too much. But I knew what I saw was real. When I returned home, there was an old photo on the table and the post with no sender. In him, I was standing in front of the house on the first day I moved in. Behind me was the silhouette of a man borrowing hands. But the most frightening thing was that the photo was taken on a day when I had never met him before. My horror stories were just beginning. After the night I received the photo, I no longer felt that this house was a safe place. The photo made me constantly think about who took it and how they could take a picture of the dead person behind me. I tried to rationally explain that it was just a trick of someone, but after every time I looked at Mr. Howard's house, the coldness returned. His door was moving, but on the glass door there was a faint mark like a human handprint. I began to see unreasonable things in the house. As objects were moved, footsteps echoed in the hallway that was well. One night I saw the shadow on the wall, slowly walking up the stairs to the second floor while I was lying on the first floor. When I woke up, the shadow disappeared, but the musty smell of the earth still lingered in the room. I started to think I was being played, but I was the only one in the house. I asked a neighbor named Linda, who lived 2 doors down. Her father had lived here for a long time and knew a lot about the neighborhood. I went to her house to ask about Mr. Howard. She said that before he died, he lived alone and rarely spoke to anyone. After his wife died, he always stood in front of my house at about 11 o'clock and waved his hand in the direction of my house. Everyone in the neighborhood said that was his way of sending his heartfelt greetings to his deceased wife. I asked where he was buried, and my mother told me to go to the cemetery not far from here. I decided to go there to see for myself. When I got to the cemetery, it was starting to rain. Among the thousands of graves, I found a headstone with the name Howard on it. On the dark mound there was a silver gravestone lying dark on the ground as if it had just been placed there. I had the feeling that someone had been there before me. As I bent down, I heard a small voice from behind me, like an old man saying slowly, "Jack, you're here again." I turned around, but there were only gravestones and the rushing rain. I went home in a state of anxiety. That night when I opened the curtains, I saw Mr. Howard's door wide open. The shadow of a man in the frame looked into my house. I knew for sure that no one lived there. He was waving his hands slowly again, but this time his movements were not smooth but jerky like a broken machine. I saw his eyes change in the rain, but then his eyes flashed to the left as if he was moving towards me. I was startled by the sound of running water in the bathroom. I knew I was not sleeping with water. When I got closer, the sound of running water stopped, but in the mirror, there was a shadow of a person standing behind me. When I turned around, there was no one. My anxiety reached its peak. I decided not to stay at home tonight. I packed my things to go to the hotel, but when I stepped out, I saw wet footsteps on the ground from the entrance to my door. Those footsteps were not accompanied by anyone. I turned back into the door and leaned my back against the wall. Every small sound startled me. In the shadows, I saw a shadowy figure pass the window and disappear. I felt as if he was walking around the house. When I opened my eyes, I saw nothing but the black shadow of the tree in the rain. But when the light flared, I saw him standing right in front of my house. His eyes closed and his hand no longer held. He just stared at my house and then disappeared into the darkness. The next morning, I saw Linda again and told her what I had seen. She was silent for a while and then said there was something I needed to know. Before he died, Mr. Howard had told the neighbors that if anyone moved to the house across the street, he would come back to make sure they didn't do anything wrong to the house. I didn't understand what that meant. Linda said he probably thought his house was in ruins because his wife was in the house that night. I opened the window just to make sure no one was out there. When I looked out onto the street, I saw only darkness. But a few minutes later, the shadow of a person appeared slowly in the mist, and this time he did not wave his hand, but just raised one hand and pointed straight at me. I felt a wave of coldness spread from the spine to the whole body. I closed the door, but there was a steady sound of knocking from outside. I did not dare to look anymore, just lay quietly listening to the rain, and the sound of knocking became a gloomy music that made me want to cry. I realized that this was no longer the shadow of a neighbor, but a soul that could not leave, and I was the only one it saw. My ghost stories had just begun to enter the real darkness. After the night, I heard the knocking sound and the shadow of a person pointing at my house. I could no longer sleep. Every night I lay in bed with my ears wide open to listen for any sound outside the window, like a person trapped in a feeling of terror that could not escape. The third night in a row, I heard a faint sound from outside the window. An old man's voice in the middle of the night. "Jack, open the door." "Jack." I did not want to check this time. I pulled the blanket over my head and tried not to hear those gloomy calls. But then the knocking sound rang out slowly, as if someone was tapping on the glass with their fingers. When I took all the strength to look out, I only saw darkness and rain. But I saw on the glass there was a trace, like a letter written in wet water. "Jack, open." I couldn't believe my eyes. I opened the window and looked out, and in that split second, I heard someone's voice right next to my ear, even though there was no one there. The next day, I went to see Linda again. I told her what was happening. She was silent for a long time, and then said that there was something I didn't know. Mr. Howard's wife didn't die of an illness, but had an accident in this house. An accident that he always blamed on himself. After that, he became a ghost and told everyone that her spirit would never leave this house. I felt a chill run down my spine when I heard that. Maybe what I saw was not just Mr. Howard's ghost, but something else. That night, I tried to put a small camera in the window to see if there was anything unusual. When I reviewed the video the next morning, I saw a shadow appear outside the window, and behind that shadow there was another smaller shadow standing still, as if looking into my house. When the flash of lightning, I saw clearly a pale face of a woman with wide black eyes. I turned off the computer. My heart was beating fast. I didn't know if I should believe what I saw anymore. I decided to go to Mr. Howard's abandoned house. When I opened the door inside the house, there was a musty smell and thick dust. On the table, there were many old photos, including a photo of a young woman with a very beautiful smile. On the back of the photo, there was the words, "Howard and Mary forever." I realized this was his wife. When I went back into the bedroom, I saw a diary that was partly wet from the rain from the basement. I opened it and read a few lines. My eyes were blurred, but there was a clear line. "I can't live without you. If you leave, I will go with you." I ran out of the house in a panic. I knew he didn't die voluntarily, but ended his life to follow his wife. And now both of them were staying in that house. That night, when I returned, I heard a small laugh from outside the door. A laugh that wasn't a man's. When I looked out for the first time, I saw a woman standing next to him, both of them waving their hands towards me. I stepped back and saw in the mirror a shadow of a person standing behind me. I could no longer distinguish between dream and reality. Every time I opened my eyes, they changed color and looked at me without blinking. I thought I had to leave this place, but some part of me was stuck there by something I couldn't explain. It was like they didn't want me to go, until I saw a new sentence written in dark ink on the window. "Don't leave us, Jack." My haunted stories had crossed the boundary of my mind and become reality that I couldn't escape. I began to feel that my house was not the same. Every time I entered, I felt a pressure in the air and a soft sound like a person breathing. The breathing sounds seemed to come from the walls and from the floor. I initially explained it as noise, but after many nights I could not deny it was unusual. Every night when I turned off the light, the house would make a sound. A low and long sound, like a long, intimate sound in my shadow. The first time I noticed it was on a rainy night. I was lying in bed when I heard someone calling, but there was no one outside. I went down the stairs and stopped in the middle of the house. The faint breathing came from behind the wall. I pressed my ear to the wall and felt many tiny feet throbbing all over my body. I swallowed the water and then opened my ear. The sound of the sound disappeared, but the wall was still quiet, as if someone had just pressed their face to it. I returned to the bedroom and saw a small drop of water on the glass, like a human handprint from inside the glass. I knew for sure that I had closed the door before going to sleep. That night I slept in a state of panic. In my dream, I saw myself standing in the middle of my house with no windows or doors to the outside. The wall of the house slowly moved closer, as if it wanted to swallow us. When I tried to run, the floor opened up into a pitch-black abyss. I fell asleep while still hearing the gloomy sound of the sound around me. The next morning, I woke up in a cold sweat. I decided to leave this house immediately. But when I packed my things became strange. Things were moved back to their original positions. The main door was locked and wouldn't open, even though I had waited. I felt as if the house didn't want me to leave. I called Linda, but no one answered. Meanwhile, I heard someone knocking on the living room door from inside. When I ran downstairs, there was no one but a footprint on the floor, as if someone had stepped in water and left it. I went back to the bedroom and saw a long streak of water running down the wall, as if something was coming down from the basement. I walked closer and heard the sound of someone whispering in the wall where Jack stayed. I was really surprised but didn't dare answer. In the night, I dreamed of Mr. Howard standing in the middle of the house with a wrinkled face and telling me that I belonged to this place. Every time I tried to escape, the house became different. It was like it was alive and adapting to keep me there. I tore off a candle in the living room, intending to check if there was anything in my shadow. When the fire burned, I saw shadows of people moving slowly on the wall. There were shadows of a man and a woman holding hands. When I turned off the light, everything disappeared, leaving only the smell of dark smoke. I looked up at the ceiling and saw the owner slowly appearing in the dust and blood. I told you I would never go. I really couldn't tell if I was living in my house or in a long dream. Every morning seemed to be a repetition, but the sounds like someone's old voice were always present. I began to think that maybe the spirits of Mr. Howard and his wife had become part of this house, and now I was stuck with them, the night before. I wrote this story. I heard a voice right next to my ear, even though there was no one else in the room. The voice was so soft that I couldn't tell if it was a man or a woman. Only 2 words were clearly heard: "Welcome home." My scary stories had become reality without me being aware of it. After the night I heard the voice "Welcome home," I could no longer sleep. Everything in the house seemed strange. Sometimes I saw the door open, even though I was sure it was locked, because the object was replaced. Things I could not explain started happening with the old mirror hanging on the bedroom wall. That mirror was the only thing I kept consciously because I thought it had any value. I had never paid attention to it before, but recently, whenever I looked at it, I saw something moving behind me even though no one was there. At first, I thought it was just a dream because my eyes were tired. But the second night in a row, I clearly saw the image of a man standing behind me in the mirror. It wasn't me or Mr. Howard. It was someone else with an expressionless face, just staring. When I turned around, there was no one there. But when I turned back, he was still there, a little closer than before. I felt cold all over. I put my hand on the mirror and didn't look at it anymore. The next morning, I put my hand on the mirror, but as soon as I touched it, it fell off. On the mirror's surface, there was a wet spot in the shape of a hand, as if someone had touched it from inside. I jumped back. When I touched the wet spot, it felt hot, as if touching my skin. I accidentally looked back into the mirror and saw that I was naked. I ran out of the room, but the cold air hit my chest, making me gasp. That night, I put a camera in front of the mirror to see if there was anything unusual. The next morning, I looked at the video and found something that made me shiver. About 3 hours later, the mirror in the video started to move slightly. In the projection, a woman was standing in front of my house in the rain. Then the camera suddenly turned on, and the reflection in the mirror changed to another room with a man and a woman holding hands. I realized it was Mr. and Mrs. Howard. I felt something was stirring in my mind. The next night, when I looked in the mirror, I saw not my room but the house opposite. Inside the mirror, Mr. Howard was standing in front of my house with his hand outstretched towards me. I felt stuck in my vision. When I turned back, I saw that my reflection in the mirror was no longer following me. It was still staring at me with a cold smile. After that, every time I passed by the mirror, I saw that the reflection was not like me. Sometimes it turned its head away, sometimes it smiled when I did not smile. I tried to take it out of the room, but every time I touched it, the mirror shook and made a small screeching sound as if it was calling for help. I took the mirror to the backyard and intended to hit it, but just as the wind rose, I heard a sound and whispered to myself, "Jack, why are you leaving us?" I let go of the mirror and ran into the house in fear. I looked back out the window and saw the mirror still standing. In a split second, the light flared up and I saw two figures in the mirror standing behind the mirror, looking at me. Every morning since that day, I have seen the mirror return to its original position on the wall as if I had taken it away. It was as if some invisible force wanted it to stay. I don't know if I am becoming more like Mr. Howard or not, but every day I find myself looking more and more like the man in the mirror. My skin becomes pale and my eyes become dim. When I smile, the person in the mirror doesn't smile back and just looks at me with pity. I have begun to believe that their soul lives in that mirror, and now I am becoming a part of it. This creepy story has only just begun. I have the feeling that this mirror is still remembering everything that has happened in this house and will never forget it. After the dark nights of the mirror, I thought I had done the worst, but I was wrong. When everything in the house began to quiet down, I began to hear footsteps on the ceiling. At first, it was just a faint sound, as if someone was walking slowly. I thought it might be a mouse or something, but then the footsteps became clearer. The sound of shoes on the floor was so clear that I could hear each step. The first time I heard it was at 3 in the morning. The footsteps started from the corner of the bedroom and went across the ceiling until they stopped right above me. I lay still and motionless at the opening. After a while, a creaking sound was heard, as if someone was moving something heavy. I got up and looked around the room but saw nothing. Everything was quiet again, but I couldn't sleep anymore. The next morning, I climbed up to the attic to see if there was anything unusual. When I opened the door, a gust of cold air blew into my eyes. Dust was everywhere, but on the dust there were clearly visible footprints. The footprints of adults had walked from the end of the attic to the gate and then disappeared. I stood still, looking around when I saw a patch of dust stirred up as if someone had just passed by. I called out, but there was no response. Only a small sound like a very close breath. I turned off the battery immediately and went downstairs. That night, I decided to listen to see when the footsteps started. At 3 a.m. they appeared again. This time the footsteps were slower, but more certain. A small knock sounded on the roof, as if someone was moving, and followed a metal object on the floor. Then the knock stopped, and the knock came from the ceiling. I looked up and saw the ceiling shaking slightly, as if someone was coming from above. I ran out of the room to find a phone and call Linda. When I told her, I heard the knock on the roof. She was silent for a long time and then said in a small voice, "I think he hasn't gone anywhere, Jack." She said Mr. Howard used to work in this very house before he died, and he had something in the attic. After his wife died, he became a different person and spent the night upstairs writing things that no one knew about. When they found him, the phone number was open next to him, and on the wall was written a single sentence she never left. I decided to go up there again. When I opened the door this time, the ceiling was no longer dusty, as if someone had swept it clean. In the middle of the space was a book lying on the floor. I lifted it up and saw the words written in the same handwriting over and over again. "I saw you everywhere. I saw you in the mirror. I saw you in everyone who came near this house." I felt cold because those words were similar to what I had been through. Then I heard the sound of paper on the floor behind me. I turned around and saw a cloaked figure standing at the end of the attic. I couldn't see clearly, but I knew it was Mr. Howard. He approached me slowly, each step following the creaking sound. When he was only a few steps away, he stopped and said in a hoarse voice, "I told you not to try to understand." Then the figure vanished like smoke. I ran downstairs, but the door closed automatically. The sound of footsteps stopped. In the darkness, I heard the footsteps again, but this time from the first floor. The sound echoed throughout the house, as if someone was circling around me. When I ran into the bedroom again, there was a steady knocking sound on the door, as if someone was knocking outside. Each knocking made the air in my room move a little dot in the morning. Everything disappeared as if it had never happened. But I knew the worst thing was not over, because on the ceiling above my bed appeared a foot that sounded like it had just been put down from the floor above. This true scary story is just a part of the encounter with the thing that I never wanted to believe existed. After the night I felt my feet on the ceiling, I began to feel that the space in the house was no longer the same. Every evening a new sound appeared. Sometimes it was the sound of a door, sometimes it was the sound of footsteps, but I knew that the worst had not yet come. On the fourth night, after it rained, I was sitting in the living room reading a book when I heard someone calling my name from downstairs. The voice was as small as the wind passing through a pipe, but it was very clear that Jack was coming down to me. I walked without moving. I rarely opened that basement. It was a dark and damp space and had not been used for many years. When I got near the basement, I saw that the wooden door was open as if someone had just used it. From downstairs, there was a faint smell of dampness and something like wet earth. I turned off the stairs and went back into the house because I didn't have the courage to continue. That night, I couldn't sleep. The voices calling my name came back many times. It was like someone was standing below the floor, calling me in a voice that must have been that of a living person. The next morning, I decided to open the door to see what was there. When I opened the door and went down the first step, the ground was the softest and I felt a cold chill from my toes up. In my shadow, I saw a wooden box in the middle of the floor. I walked closer and picked it up. On the top of the box was the letters HM, which were probably the initials of Howard and Mary. I didn't dare open it, but as I felt it, a warm feeling spread through my palm as if someone was holding my hand from inside. I let go and ran. When I closed the door, there was a knocking sound from inside, as if something had hit the wall. That night, I put the door down, but at 2 a.m., the voice calling my name came again. This time, it was not faint, but clear. Jack opened the door. I lay still and listened to the slow footsteps around the bedroom. I could hear the sound of rustling and the musty smell coming from the basement. When I pulled the covers over me, the knocking on the bedroom door began. The knocking was slow and steady, like the rhythm of my heartbeat. The next morning, I saw Linda again. She told me that I had been called by the basement. She said that as soon as Mr. Howard's wife died, he put the box of wood under his bed and never took it out again. He said it was a way to keep her close to him. When he left, people found the door to the house was frozen from the inside. No one could explain it. I understood that something in the wooden box was the cause. That night, I decided to open it to end things. When I went down to the door, I felt the flashlight, its light shining on the dark walls. When I got close to the wooden box, everything became cold. I opened the box and inside was an old, half-wet photograph. On the photograph were Mr. and Mrs. Howard standing in front of this very house. On the back of the photograph was written in faded ink, "We will never leave." As soon as I finished reading the letter, I heard footsteps approaching behind me. When I turned around, I saw a cloaked figure standing at the bottom of the stairs looking down at me. He pointed at me and then at the wooden box. The woman's voice echoed from the room, faint but clear. "Thank you, Jack, for bringing him back." I ran to the door and the sound of the door closed, but the knocking continued for hours. The coldness radiated from the door and throughout the room. When I looked back at the picture in the box, I saw that it was not just Mr. and Mrs. Howard anymore, but a third person standing behind them with a face like mine. This haunted stories is when I realized that maybe their spirits were connected to me and I could not escape. After opening the box in my jaw, I felt like I had released something that shouldn't have been released. But the next day, I started to see strange signs appearing in the house. The windows were opened so I would shake before I went to sleep. The footsteps were no longer just on the floor, but were circling the house all night. The most frightening things started one rainy night. I was sitting on the sofa in the living room, looking out the window, and saw a figure standing outside. At first, I thought it was a neighbor, but when I got closer, I realized something unbelievable. It was me. Another version of me was standing in the rain, looking into the house with a cold smile. The whole person was wet, but the eyes were not blinking. I couldn't bear to move my arms and legs. I just sat there and watched. When I tried to stand up, the figure still moved in a way that looked exactly like me. I ran into the bedroom of the other person. The sound of the alarm outside brightened the room in an instant, and I saw that figure standing right in front of my window. He no longer looked like me, but his face was pale, his eyes were dark, and his mouth was wide open. He put his hand on the glass from outside and slowly wrote a sentence in water. "You belong here." I backed away and fell to the ground, unable to breathe. When I woke up, Everything became as quiet as a nightmare. But on the window glass, there was still a watermark in the shape of a letter, as if someone had written it. I was so depressed that I did not dare to open the curtains at night. Linda came to see me because she saw that I had not answered the phone for many days. When my dad walked in, he said it felt very cold and there was a musty smell in the living room, like a dungeon. I told her the whole story. He said that Mr. Howard's spirit might have trapped me in its loop and was taking my shape to keep me there. I didn't want to believe it, but every night after that, I saw a figure that looked like me outside the house. Sometimes he would walk around the house, slowly, like a vigilante. When I turned off the lights, he disappeared, but every time I turned him on, he was closer. I set up the camera to record it again, but the next morning, all the footage was black. There was only one other spot where the light was on and was standing in front of the house looking into the camera. I could no longer tell what was real and what was an illusion. The people I saw in the mirror continued to smile at me. Every time I passed through the window, I saw that my reflection was not completely centered. Sometimes it walked slower, sometimes it smiled even though I was not smiling. I felt as if the remaining soul in the wooden box was speaking into me. The following night, after everything had begun, I heard a voice right next to my ear that sounded like me, but was not me. It only said 2 words, "Welcome back." When I opened my eyes, I was standing on the floor looking into the window while another version of me was standing inside the house looking out. I did not know where I was or who it was. After that night, people in the neighborhood said they saw me walking around the house at night but never came back. My door was locked and no one saw me again. But every rainy night, someone would come to my house and see a person standing behind the glass with a cold smile. This true horror story is a warning to anyone who thinks they are alone. Sometimes what is looking at you from the outside is another version of yourself. After the night, I found myself standing outside my bedroom door. I could no longer sleep. I had the feeling that there was more than one person in the house. Every time I opened my bedroom door, I would mark it with tape and nails, but the next morning everything was back. The sheets on the floor were wet, as if someone had been in. At first, I thought it was the wind or the humidity, but when I saw the wet feet on the floor leading to the bedroom, it was inexplicable. I began to see myself in places where I could not see. One time, I looked through the kitchen mirror and saw my shadow standing outside the bedroom looking in. Another time, I saw my reflection in the bedroom mirror, but it did not move with me. Its face looked straight at me with a knowing look. I was haunted by the feeling that someone was watching me all the time. Linda came to my house again after many days without hearing from me. When she came in, she said the atmosphere in my house was unusually heavy. The curtains were drawn to the ceiling by the wind. I told her that I wanted to leave immediately. She advised me to stay until tomorrow morning because it was raining heavily outside. But that night, I became even darker than ever. At about 3 a.m., when the rain was coming, I heard the glass rattling softly. I went out to the living room and found all the windows wide open. The wind was so strong that the curtains were rolled up to the ceiling. I tried to close each door, but each time I closed and opened it, another one opened. When I closed the last door, I turned around and saw written in rain on the glass, "Let me in." I felt my skin turn cold. When I looked closely, the words began to blur and turned into a face. The eyes in the mirror looked straight at me and then disappeared. I turned back to the main door to run out of the house and saw that all the doors had automatically closed. The room was completely dark, as if there was no light source. I stood in the middle of the living room in the dark. Only the sound of wind and water could be heard. In the dark, I saw a shadow on the glass, moving. It walked slowly closer to me. I retreated. It also retreated like a game, but when I stood still, it continued to move forward. I ran into the bedroom, turned off all the lights and closed the curtains, but I could still see the small light coming from outside. In the dim light, I saw my reflection standing right in front of the door, even though I was that far away. I began to understand that something was trying to take my place. Every time I looked at the mirror, it got closer. I remembered what Linda had said, that the trapped soul would find a body to continue its existence. Maybe that other version was it. I took a pen and wrote a line on the wall to remind myself not to look at the mirror, but the next morning the reflection was gone. I began to hear voices in my room. Jack opened the window. The voice was not of a person, but the cold wind that seemed to come from everywhere. When I did not answer the mirror, it opened even though there was no wind. I saw a silver hand placed on the mirror frame from outside. My eyes could not leave it. I heard that voice for the last time. It was my voice, but I was not me. When I woke up, all was quiet, but the windows were open. Outside, there was only rain and my shadow on the glass. I knew I was no longer inside. This creepy story is a song about how sometimes the one looking at you from the outside is not someone else, but the version you have left in the dark. After the nights of the open window and the shadow that always appeared on my mirror, I no longer suspected that this house had something living inside it. But I did not know that what I was about to experience was even scarier than the shadow outside the window. Everything started with small sounds from the bedroom wall. The sound was as soft as the sound of hands brushing against the surface of the wood, and then became a very small whisper. At first, I thought it was just the sound of wind passing through the water, but then the voice became clearer. It was a woman's voice. That night, I heard clearly the first words. It said, "Jack, can you listen to me?" I moved my ear. The voice came from inside the wall, as if from a deep space that I did not know existed. I started and pressed my ear to the wall and heard a soft whisper and a cry. Something was in there. I took a wooden stick and gently tapped the wall, but nothing came out. Only a warm smell, like the smell of stale earth. The next morning, I told Linda. Her face turned pale, and she told me not to tap the wall anymore. She said that the house was built on the foundation of an old building and that someone had disappeared during its construction. That person had never been found. Some people believed that their body was trapped inside the wall. Her words sent a chill down my spine. The next night, I heard more tapping on the wall. But this time it was not a woman's voice, but two voices, a man and a woman, talking to each other. The man's voice sounded like Mr. Howard, saying, "I told you not to go," and then there was crying and tapping on the wall. I lay on the bed, not daring to move my hands or feet, only hearing the sound right next to my ear, as if someone was talking from inside the wall. The voice was so low that it turned into a laugh, so small and cold. I used all my strength to walk around the house in the dark. When I got close to the hallway, the corner of the wall began to have a warm water stain dripping down. The water ran in dark circles and then formed the shape of a face on the wall. Its eyes looked at me and then disappeared when I closed my eyes. I ran into the living room, but the knocking continued without stopping. The wall seemed to be breathing every time I tried to listen, and it responded with a sound like a warning. Aku decided to use the microphone placed near the wall. The next morning when I listened again, I only heard a faint sound and a single, clear voice saying no one leaves. I turned off the machine immediately. From then on, I always had the feeling that someone was watching me from all over the wall. Every time I passed by, I felt a cold air coming out as if someone was breathing on me. I started to see small cracks on the wall as if there were sticky fingers. When I touched the wall, I heard someone's voice coming out right next to my ear as if telling me, "I was almost there, Jack." I ran outside even though it was raining heavily. When I turned back to look at the house from afar, I saw a light open in the second-floor window and a woman looking out through glasses. I did not return to the house for many days. When I returned, all the objects were covered with dust, but on the bedroom wall, a new writing appeared, written in some kind of black language. I said I was hitting the wall with a knife. When I put my ear to it for the last time, I heard a woman's voice say, "Thank you for listening." Then there was complete silence. But I know the spirit has not gone anywhere because every night I hear the church wall whispering as if it were calling my name again. I told myself that everything I had heard was just a dream from not sleeping for days in a row. But that night something started to happen to the light. At about 1 a.m., I was lying in bed when the lights in the room started to flicker. At first it was just a little bit, and then it started to move in a certain rhythm. I thought it was the electricity, so I went down to turn off the switch, but the lights did not turn off, but became brighter. The light shone straight into the wall where a dark motor appeared and said, "Help me." I jerked back. The motor disappeared and the light went off for a minute. The room was so. I turned on the light and just a second later, the light in the hallway came on. I went out and looked around and all the lights in the house started to flash on and off continuously like a signal. I called Linda's name in a daze even though she was no longer there. The light moved from one room to another and back again. Every time it came on, I heard a faint sound like a house in mourning. I knew I couldn't be alone anymore. I ran to the main door, but my hand wouldn't open the lock. Every time I turned the knob, the light in the other room came on. My shadow on the floor didn't follow me. It stood still while I kept moving. I turned to look, and it was gone. In my mind, I heard a small voice among the flickering lights. It said, "Jack, we are still here." Voices echoed from all over the house, following the light every time a shadow came on. I realized that the light was no longer a mindless thing, but the eye of something looking at me. I went to the living room and saw the light on the ceiling slowly turning round, forming a circle around my feet. In that circle of light appeared the silhouettes of a man and a woman holding hands and looking at me. I was startled. The woman's voice rang out like a dream. I told him not to look around. When I was about to run away, the light went out and all of them entered my shadow. In a few seconds, I heard footsteps approaching me and the light returned. In front of me was the silhouette of a man with silvery eyes. "Mr. Howard," he said in a hoarse voice that echoed over the phone, "I never want to go." "Jack." Each light in the house began to light up one by one and then went out. When all the lights returned, I realized that the room had changed. On the wall were letters written in reverse letters, like the dark God, "Don't look away." I felt my eyes being sucked into the light. The light in the house began to flicker, as if each shadow was a living creature. Shadowy images appeared in the light of the past. I saw Mr. and Mrs. Howard living in this house, laughing and talking happily, then the scene of her falling down the stairs. He hugged her body, crying in the dark, and everything was swallowed into the dark. When the light went out for the last time, I heard the sound of the ghost I had said I did not understand. I opened the door again. I was standing in the middle of the living room. All the shadows were gone. The shadows were scattered on the floor, but in each shadow there was a small light running like a shadow. I looked down and saw my face reflected in the small shadow. Since that day, the light in my house has never turned off. Even when I unplug it, it still glows dimly. Every night, I hear a small voice in the flickering light saying thank you for staying with us. I can no longer tell if I am a human being or just a shadow of something in this house. This animated horror story is a reminder that sometimes light does not bring safety, but is just something looking at you from the other side of darkness. After the nights of the house lights not turning off, I thought that everything was over, but no. What happened next made me doubt the time around me. It all started with the clock hanging on the living room wall. It was the old clock that I had seen since I moved in, but never paid attention to. One night, I was sitting on the chair when I heard an unusual ticking sound. At first, I didn't notice it, but when I looked closely, I saw that the clock hands were turning backwards. I stood up and walked closer, and the ticking sound became louder, as if someone had accidentally turned it backwards. The second hand turned so fast that only a faint line of sky could be seen, then stopped at number 3. When I touched the clock, the whole room was quiet. There was no sound of wind or water outside the window. Everything became unusually quiet. I walked around but felt like the atmosphere in the house was different, like I was in another time. In a split second, I saw a couple sitting on the living room sofa talking. I recognized it was Mr. and Mrs. Howard. They smiled and looked at each other happily, as if they had not died. I stepped back and everything disappeared. When I looked back, the clock was running normally again. I thought it was just a dream, but I was wrong. That night, when I fell asleep, I dreamed that the house was the same as before. The sky was brighter, the walls were newly painted, and the floor was clean. I saw myself standing in the corner of the house watching Mr. and Mrs. Howard repairing the clock. He turned to me and said in a sad voice, "If it turns around, everything will be as before." Then he disappeared, while the ticking continued in his sleep. The next morning I took the clock off, and saw that on the back it had the words Mary, 1958. Maybe that was the year they built this house. From then on, every time I looked at the clock, it turned around. Each time I saw a different scene of the neighborhood. Sometimes it was Mrs. Howard under the sun. Sometimes he was sitting in the living room holding something like a wooden box. Each time the clock stopped, everything around me grew cold. I began to feel like everything around me was repeating itself. The evenings were all the same. The light in the house never changed color. Linda called me, but I didn't receive anything. The next few seconds, the clock turned back again, and I saw yesterday's me walking through the living room. I looked at myself in a panic, but that version didn't see me. It went to the clock, touched it, and disappeared. I realized that this clock could hold the souls and time of those who had lived here. Every time the hands turned back, it was a time to expand the house between the present and the past. At the last night, the clock stopped, no longer running, but the ticking sound still echoed in my head. When I opened my eyes, everything around me had changed. Outside the window was a different world with antique cars and dark sky. On the chair in front of me, Mr. Howard was sitting, smiling softly and saying, "Welcome home, Jack." The clock started to run backwards forever, and I no longer knew what year I was. Living in this short, scary story is a warning that there are things that if stopped can protect you, but if turned back will put you in a vicious cycle. After the clock in the house turned back and took me back to the area, I returned to the present, but no longer knew what stage of time I was in. It was raining, and then it was dark, and there was no day. All the neighbors around here were silent, except for my house and the house next door where Mr. Howard lived. I had never heard the door open before, but recently I began to hear a soft knocking sound from inside. At first I thought it was an animal or the wind, but the knocking had a rhythm, as if someone was knocking out a message. Every night around 2 a.m., the knocking started again, like a song calling me out. I vowed to ignore it, but the noise made me unable to resist. On Tuesday night, I stood in front of Mr. Howard's house for the first time in many years. The door was locked, but there was a soft handprint on the surface, as if someone had touched it recently. I pressed my ear to the door and heard the sound of running water and a soft whisper. I knocked softly and then it was quiet. After a few seconds, the knocking came back 3 times slowly from inside. I was back in the wilderness. When I returned to my house, I saw the Howard door slowly open, even though there was no wind. Inside was only pitch black darkness. I took all the courage I could and stepped into the house. But there was nothing in it except old pictures and a chair. On the chair were a pile of dust and a half-open bedroom. I looked up and saw someone's trembling handwriting on Jack, "We are waiting." I put the bedroom down and ran home. That night, I closed the door, but still heard the sound of knocking from the other side of the street. This time, the knocking was not only in the Howard house, but also on my door. When I looked out the window, I saw a figure standing in front of the electricity. It was a tall man with an old head. He did not move, he just stood there. I used the flashlight to shine the light, but the figure was gone. But the next morning, there was a black watermark in the shape of a hand on my door. I knew Mr. Howard had returned, but I did not know why. Linda advised me to leave this area, but I knew I was stuck in the loop of this house and could not leave. The 5th night, I heard the knocking again, but this time it was from the backyard. I opened the door, following the sound, and saw the Howard door open. The light came out in the afternoon, as if someone was waiting for me. I walked closer and saw on the wall of the house old pictures of different couples. Each picture had a man and a woman, but the difference was that the man in each picture looked like Mr. Howard. I ran out of the house but slipped and fell on the wet floor. When I went outside, I saw written on my door in the rain, "Come inside, Jack." My door opened automatically and I saw in my shadow 2 people standing side by side. One was Mr. Howard and the other was me. When I went back, it was all over and I was alone in the middle of the road in the rain. Since that day, no one has seen me again. Everyone in the neighborhood said that at night there was a man standing in front of the Howard house, slowly opening the door. When people looked more closely, they realized he looked exactly like the man who had disappeared in the house opposite. This Home Alone story is a warning that sometimes your neighbor is not really gone but just waiting for you to come into their house. After all the horrors the Howards had done, I thought I would never see them again, but they did come back. The first time I had fallen asleep in my chair, I was awakened by a faint sound of rain. At first, I thought it was just the wind and water falling on the roof, but then I realized it was calling my name. Jack. The voice was soft but clear in the raindrops that fell on the glass. I walked to the window and looked out. The street in the neighborhood was covered in rain. Every house was dark except mine. The rain had left long streaks on the glass, like fingerprints. I put my hand on it and felt as cold as if I had touched my skin. When I pulled my hand away, the words "We are still here" appeared on the glass. I backed away and fell to the floor, my heart pounding. I couldn't sleep that night. The sound of rain continued all night long. Amidst the sounds was a small laugh and a soft knock on the glass door. The next morning I went to Linda's house, but she wasn't there. The door was wide open, and the only thing in the house was a wooden chair. On the chair was a wet piece of paper written in shaky handwriting. Jack couldn't open the door when it rained. I held the paper in my hand and felt cold, but I didn't have time to return before it rained again. I ran home in a panic. When I closed the door, I heard my name being called throughout the house. Everyone thought there was the sound of running water inside. The sound of running water was no longer soft, but had become a small, steady trickle. I pressed my ear to the wall and heard a woman's voice. "Jack, we never left." When I looked out the window, I saw a shadow on the street in the rain. It was a man wearing a hat like Mr. Howard. He walked slowly and stopped right in front of my house. In the dim light, I saw a woman behind him. We both looked up at my window. When I rolled down the curtains, the knocking on the glass started. Every time it rained, they came back. I tried to listen to the rain, but I couldn't. The sound rang in my head as if I were deaf. The voice kept calling my name and then became clear. Jack opened the window. I used all my strength to walk to the window. Outside it was raining and the water was up to my feet. The thing standing outside was no longer a person, but a blurry shadow in the rain. I turned off the light, but it was no use. The light shining into the room revealed a shadow of a person standing right behind the curtain. A pair of white hands pressed against the curtain as if about to step in. I ran out of the room, but the sound of running water still followed me. When I looked up at the ceiling, I saw water dripping from the cracks. The water was not clear water, but a thick black liquid that ran down to the floor. I ran out of the house in the rain. When I looked back from afar, I saw my window lit up, but clearly saw a person standing behind the curtain looking out. I did not know who that person was or which version of me he was, but I knew that every time it rained, another person would appear to replace him. Since that day, whenever I buy rain, I dare not open the door, because I know that the sound of rain outside is not only the sound of the sky, but also the sound of people who have never left that house. This story of rain sounds is a warning that sometimes the sound of rain you hear is not only the sound of nature, but also the prayers of souls searching for the way back. After the last rainy night, I thought I had nothing left to lose. But the next morning, when the sky was clear, I looked out behind the house and saw a small dirt road that I had never seen before. It led into a dark forest not far from the house. While I looked into the forest, I felt like something was looking back. The trees were tall enough to block the sun, and the air was cold. I told myself that it was probably just an old dirt road and was blocking the view, but I still felt uneasy. That night, when I looked out the window behind the house, I saw the road glowing slightly as if there was a light rising from the ground. The light was not from a flashlight or a road, but from the small blue dust particles floating around. At the same time, I heard someone calling my name from the forest. Jack came back. The voice was soft but clear in the quiet night. I took all my courage and turned on the flashlight and followed the path. When I stepped into the first forest, I felt the atmosphere change. The rain was gone, but the ground was wet, as if it had not been washed by someone. The sound of a gong sounded far away, as if someone was digging the ground. I turned on the flashlight and saw the fresh feet going deeper into the forest. With each step I took, the light in front of me turned off, as if it did not want me to see. After a while, I saw a small abandoned house in the middle of the forest. The door was open and there was a light inside. When I got closer, the light went out for a moment, leaving only my shadow. I put my ear to the door and heard the sound of dripping water and then the sound of the sinking. I told him not to come back. I recognized Linda's voice. I opened the door, but inside there was only a mirror and an old wooden chair. On the chair was a picture of my old brother and Mr. Howard standing in front of the house. On the back of Mr. Howard was written the words, "He is not gone." I felt the air suddenly cold. When I turned back, the door shook. From inside my shadow, someone stepped out. It was Mr. Howard. He looked at me with wide eyes and said in a voice that echoed in the air, "I told him not to come back, Jack. Everyone here is part of this house." Then he disappeared into the darkness, and only the sound of wind and the sound of the gong continued to echo. I ran out of the woods, but the path became longer. Every step I took, the ground beneath my feet seemed to change. Finally, I returned home, but everything was different. The window was wide open, and the light in the house was the most yellow. On the table was the old picture I had seen in the woods. The only difference was that in the picture now there were 3 people, Mr. and Mrs. Howard and me. From that day on, I could no longer see the path behind my house, but every night I would hear a faint call from the woods. Sometimes I would lie in bed and hear footsteps on the wet floor outside the window and a voice calling my name in the wind. "Jack, come back to us." This creepypasta is a warning that there are paths that only appear to those who have been chosen. And if you see it at night, it's best never to enter. After what happened, I no longer had the courage to live in that house. Every night, I heard my name being called from the wind and footsteps on wet grass. I decided to leave, at least for a while, to escape from it. I packed some things and went to a forest more than an hour away from the city, where people said it was quiet and beautiful like a painting. I thought that in the middle of nature, I would find peace again. When I got there, the sun was setting behind the trees. I sat down near a small stream. The sound of running water and the scent of trees helped me feel more comfortable after sleepless nights. At night, I lit a small fire and sat listening to my ancestors in the forest. Everything seemed peaceful until the second time in the past year that I felt that way. But as the night grew darker, I began to hear a faint voice from somewhere in the woods. The voice was so familiar, it made me stop. It was Linda's voice. I turned the flashlight outside, but could only see myself. The wind was so strong that it made the fire flicker and then fade away, leaving only a faint light from the flashlight. I turned back and saw a teardrop on the side of the grass, forming the words, "Jack, come back." I kept looking around, but saw no one. When I opened my eyes, the wind was so strong that all the trees were tilting in one direction as if something was moving around me. I tried to calm down, but the sound became clearer. From all around me came different voices calling my name. Each voice sounded like someone I knew. Linda, Mr. Howard, and myself. When I heard my voice from inside the shadow, I knew I was no longer alone. I froze and tried not to hear the footsteps that started. The footsteps walked around slowly in circles. Each time I walked, a small laugh rang out. I took out my phone to call someone, but there was no signal. My screen showed no signal and then went black. Outside, the wind stopped, but the footsteps did not stop. When I put my ear to the ground, I could clearly hear the words, "Jack, you never left under the ground." I opened my eyes and looked out and saw a small light in the middle of the forest, like a running fire. When I got closer, I saw another light. Inside, a figure was sitting silently, its face turned towards me. I knocked softly, but no one answered. When I opened the door, there was no one there. Only a mirror and a picture of me standing in front of my house. Below the mirror was a line written in earthenware, "We brought home to you." I turned back and heard the sound of running water flowing back towards me. From the stream nearby, the water began to turn black. I ran back to the car, but the forest became vast and endless. With each step I took, the trees changed position. When I turned back, I saw my lover standing right behind me as if he had never left. In the darkness, there was a person sitting in the place where I had just left. That person turned back, and it was me, with wide eyes and a cold smile. Since that day, no one has seen me in the forest again. People only saw my horse left by the stream, and at night in the forest there was a small light that, sometimes green and sometimes yellow, appeared and then went out. Those who heard the sound of the wind passing through the forest that night, said they, heard the sound of Ghost Jack coming back. This camping horror story is a song that there are things you can't leave behind, no matter how far you run. After a dark night in the woods, I went for a walk in the light rain. Every step was hot and cold. I don't know how long I walked, but on the way, I saw an old sign that said, "The Evergreen Motel." The red neon light flickered as if it was about to go out. I decided to go inside to rest and regain my strength. When I entered the front of the motel, everything was quiet as if it was Monday. There was only the sound of wind and the musty smell of old cement. At the entrance, an elderly woman sat behind an old computer. She smiled when she saw me and said that there was only one room left, number 1. I took the key and thanked her. As I walked down the long hallway, I noticed that the other doors were all solid and had no light. My room was at the end of the corridor, the yellow light shining on the dark walls. When I entered, everything was old but unusually clean. On the table was a clock with the hands not moving. It stopped at 2:47. I didn't pay much attention, just lay down to rest. But after a few minutes, I heard someone moving around in the corridor. The footsteps were light, but long and heavy. I opened the door and looked out, but all I could see was the dark corridor. At the end of the corridor was a figure standing silently, looking in my direction. I couldn't see clearly, only his face changed to wet as if he had just walked in the rain. I retreated into the quiet of the door. When I turned back, I saw a small picture on the wall that wasn't there before. In him was a woman in latan and a man standing guard in front of the Evergreen Motel, but the color of the picture was faded and had a wet stain. When I touched the picture, the glass was shaking and a drop of water fell down. Just then, the phone rang in the room. Picked up the phone and could only hear a small sound and a woman's voice saying, "Clearly, get out." I put the phone down and felt my heart beat fast. When I looked back at the clock on the table, it was still at 2:47, but the second hand started to move back. I turned on the flashlight and looked around and saw the woman's shadow in the mirror hanging in front of the room. She was looking at me and smiling softly. I ran out into the hallway, but every door was wide open. Inside the rooms were other long hallways with no end. Every time I ran into a room, it returned to its original position. I turned back to the room and saw that no one was there. On the balcony, there was only a nameplate that said reception was empty. I ran out, but when I opened the door to the street, I saw that it was still night, but the neon lights were off. On the beach, there were only faint flickering lights. When I looked back through the window, I saw that woman standing inside with her back turned to me. When she turned back, her face was pale and her cold smile was clearly visible. I ran away from there and never came back again. But I knew the most frightening thing was that I still had the room key in my pocket. Every night when I slept, I always heard the clock next to my bed stop at 2:47 and then start to turn. This haunted story is about a place where time stops just to hold those who have yet to leave. If you see a roadside motel with neon lights, never go in. After the night at the Evergreen Motel, I continued on without looking back. The road to the city was long, and all I could hear was the wind and the sound of engines. I thought I had gotten rid of all the feelings of being watched that never went away. When I stopped at a gas station, I kept thinking about my feet and saw a strange radio on the shelf. It was a 60s radio, dark brown and a little dusty, but the thing was that as I got closer, I could hear a faint sound coming from it, even though no one was picking it up. I turned it up and turned the knob. The sound increased, and suddenly a tiny voice came out. It sounded like me perfectly. It said, "Jack, can you hear me?" I thought about the radio. I thought someone was talking, but all around me was me and the salesman who was asleep. The voice on the radio continued, "Jack, why did you leave?" I turned it off and left it on the radio, but after a few seconds it turned back on automatically. It was no longer my voice, but a woman's voice. I recognized Linda's voice. She spoke in a soft voice, but I was stuck in here. I couldn't get out. I took the radio out to the car because I didn't want to leave it there. When I got in the car, I turned it off, but every time the car passed a corner, it would make a small noise, like a conversation between two people. I thought it was just a magnetic effect, but then I heard the words clearly. My voice asked if I could see Mr. Howard. Linda's voice replied that we were all there. I felt cold. I stopped the car in the middle of the road and turned on the radio. The green light from the small screen shone in my eyes. It was not music, but a small sound like running water that turned into a cold laugh. Then a man's voice rang out clearly. I told him to stop. I turned off the radio and threw it out of the window. The laughs continued to ring in the car as if in my ears. I drove on until I saw him reach the city, but when I looked in the rearview mirror, I saw a small brown object behind the passenger seat. I turned around and saw the radio sitting there as if it had never been moved. I stopped the car in the middle of the road, took it out again, and slammed it down. When the radio rang out, I saw an old photo in the middle of the machine. On it was Linda and me standing in front of the old house. The back of his hand was a small handwritten word, "You brought us back." I felt my arm go numb and the radio played for the last time. The voice turned into my voice, saying something else, "Jack, you never left." Since that day, every time I turned on the car radio on any channel, I only heard a voice repeating, "I'm here." At night, I hear it draw out in a whisper. I don't know if the radio has disappeared or if it's still there with me every time. This true story is a lesson that there are things you shouldn't answer, because sometimes the thing that answers you is not alive. I returned to the city hoping to start anew. The apartment I rented was small but clean and quiet. Everything was normal for the first few days until I noticed a large mirror near the living room wall. It had a different black wooden frame with a pattern and was a little worn at the bottom corner. The landlord said it was his property and asked me not to throw it away because it was part of the apartment. I agreed because I didn't want to see rubbish, but I didn't know that the mirror itself would reveal another path. From the first night, I noticed something wrong with my reflection in the mirror. When I smiled, the image in the mirror didn't smile back. Its eyes looked at me through the glass as if it had a mind of its own. I told myself it was just a dream, but as the days passed, the feeling grew clearer. Every morning when I looked at the mirror, the image in the mirror always turned its head slowly for more than a second. Sometimes I turned away, but still saw my reflection in the mirror still standing there. watching me. One night, I fell asleep and decided to watch TV to forget. When I turned off the screen, I saw on the dark side of the mirror the reflection was looking at me. The charming light from outside made the mirror glow a warm blue. I walked closer and saw a small drop of water in the mirror. I reached out and touched the cold glass. When I pulled my hand away, the words "Back home, Jack" appeared on the mirror. I stepped back and looked more carefully and saw that in the mirror I was not alone, but another person standing behind my shoulder. When I turned around, there was no one there. My heart was beating fast. I stood in front of the mirror for a while and saw my reflection slowly smiling. It smiled wider and its eyes were dark. I ran out of the room and turned off all the lights, but the mirrors were still emitting a small light. The next morning, I told my neighbors, and they said that the owner of this apartment was a man who was haunted by an accident. He had hit the mirror but then disappeared without a trace. Everyone believed that his soul was trapped in it. I knew I had to leave this place, but before I could do anything, the mirror began to emit a small sound like a whisper. I put my ear to it and heard a small voice. I told him not to turn around. I stood in front of the mirror again and saw another room. Behind the reflection was my old apartment with the window open and the sky outside. There was a shadow of a person standing in the middle of the room with his back turned. When that person turned his head, I realized it was me. The version in the mirror stepped closer and pressed his hand against the glass. Before I could react, the glass shook and an arm from within reached out and stuck to me. I felt a cold chill run up my whole body and then I froze. When I woke up, I was standing in another room. Everything was reversed and in the mirror was my apartment. Outside, I saw my other version living normally. It looked into the mirror and did not see me. I realized I was stuck on the other side of the mirror. Every time the other side looked at me, it smiled. This revenge story is a reminder that sometimes what looks back at you is not always you. If you see your reflection smile before you smile, run away immediately. After being glued to the world in the mirror, I thought I was dead. Everything around me was a copy of reality. The colors were dark and all sounds were sucked out. I could see myself on the other side of the mirror, living a normal life. He went to work, ate, slept, and laughed with everyone. But sometimes I saw him looking into the mirror longer than usual, as if he knew I was there. I tried to tap the mirror but only heard a dull sound and no response. Immediately after that, I realized that every time I came to my room and the other side turned off, my world would light up. And every time he laughed, the shadow in the mirror would automatically laugh too. I began to change. My face became darker and colder than usual, until one night when the other person was sleeping, I saw its shadow on the mirror moving slowly, but it didn't move. The shadow gradually got smaller and disappeared. When the other person woke up, he didn't see his shadow anymore. From that moment on, I saw the other person changed. He didn't smile anymore. He didn't move. He just sat in front of the mirror looking at me. In the mirror, I saw that person's face was pale like a dead person. When he raised his hand to the mirror, I felt cold all over. He looked at Jack and said, "It's my turn." The glasses were cold and everything was off. When I opened my eyes, I was on the other side of the mirror. Everything was normal again. But I knew that the person who had gone out was no longer me. The person in my mirror was now living in the real world. It carries my form everywhere, talking to everyone, but its face has no emotion. Every time I stand in front of the mirror, looking into the place I remember, I said it was my turn. I am stuck here with no way back. Everything in the mirror world is just an endless repetition of the images I have lost. Over time, I realized that my shadow in the mirror world also began to change. It no longer follows me. It stops silently watching me when I move. Every time I turn away, I see it getting closer. Sometimes, when I open my eyes, I see my shadow standing on the ceiling. It no longer has a human form, but is just a solid black mass with bright eyes. I can hear it in my head. Keep it well, because I am a real person now. Everything dragged on until I could no longer recognize who I was. The outside world continued to live as if nothing had happened, and I was just a shadow wandering in a space without time. Every time someone looked in the mirror and saw a light shining from the glass, I was looking at them. This scary story is a warning that sometimes what you see in the mirror or in my shadow is not your reflection, but something that is taking your place. If one day your shadow moves on its own, it is too late.